Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed. Hi, welcome to Writers in Focus. I'm your host, James Taylor, and today I'm delighted to have as my guest Mr. Josh Russell. May I call you Josh?
Yes.
I'd like to welcome you to the Atlanta Fulton Public Library and the Fulton County Government Center. By way of introduction, we're here today to talk about your third novel, A True History of the Captivation, Transport to Strange Lands, and Deliverance of Hannah Guttentag, published by Deliverance Books?
Yes, Deliverance.
So far, so good. Josh is the author of two previous novels, Yellow Jack and My Bright Midnight, and has written many short stories for many small literary magazines. You grew up in Normal, Illinois. Mm-hmm. You have an undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland and an MFA, Master's of Fine Arts in Writing, from LSU. You've had many strange jobs, including that of an editorial assistant to one of my favorite strange men, Andrei Codrescu,
yes,
of NPR, the Romanian poet in New Orleans. So far, so good. You are currently an associate professor of English and co-director of the creative writing program at Georgia State University. And I'm looking at my notes here, Josh, and you're just another typical novelist from Decatur, Georgia.
Yeah,
put that all
that's
together.
Where we like to get together. Safety in numbers.
So listen, I'd like to begin by talking about this wonderful book, and then we'll talk about the creative writing department at GSU, the state of writing in America, how you're going to be rich and famous one of these days, how this first edition of Yellow Jack is going to make me rich and famous in 30 years.
No doubt.
Okay, A True History of the Captivation, Transport to Strange Lands, and Deliverance of Hannah Guttentag. I didn't read any reviews of the book until I started reading it. And until about a third of the way through it, I suddenly got it. You're trying to say in many ways that Indian captivation narratives of the 16th and 17th century have a lot in common with the experience of graduate students in universities in America in the 1990s. Now, come on.
Well, it's kind of the one of the things that I've done in all three of my novels is take what seems to be this almost impossible concept and then kind of tease a novel out of it. And so the impossible concept that I wanted to tease a novel out of in this book was the idea that, you know, women are no longer taken captive by the natives who come and burn down the village, the Puritan-era village in Massachusetts instead, and taken into the woods. Instead, they kind of elect to go into the woods. You know, they go to these graduate programs that are often kind of in the middle of nowhere, and you get indoctrinated. And I mean, and then the parallels are the goofy parallels kind of delighted me. One of the complaints in women's Indian captivity narratives, like that of Mary Rowlandson, is that they're made to watch strange dancing and eat strange food, which is kind of what goes on in grad school. You have to watch people dance strangely, and you have to eat strange food and try to acclimate. So, you know, from that goofy idea, I hope I wrote a book that was a little less than goofy.
Let's stop for a minute and tell the audience you're in charge of an academic department, co-chair of the creative writing department at Georgia State University. I've been to graduate school, and it's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. And your book is full of that sense of verisimilitude. You create graduate school. See if I make any sense. You're smart in high school, you go to college. You're really smart in college, you want to get a further degree, become an English teacher, creative writing novelist, a physicist, whatever. You need an advanced degree. You go to graduate school, and you're among the smartest of the smart. Hannah, your protagonist, is a graduate of University of Tennessee. She's accepted to Cornell Ivy League. So it's like this gradation. Am I so far so good?
Yes.
And everything seems to be exacerbated, and in fancy word to describe, when you get to graduate school, all of those foibles that people have. If they drink too much, they drink far too much in graduate school. If they read too much in college, that's all they do is read until they're blind in graduate school. Tell me about this.
Well, it really is, as you describe it, it's kind of like a hothouse, because the only thing that goes on is school.
Yeah.
And it's really serious. Everybody is there to do the same thing. Nobody has really any extracurricular interests. The only thing that Hannah does when she goes to Ithaca is involve herself in the graduate program. Thankfully or not, that means involving herself with Frank, who ends up her husband. But the way that you describe it, I think, is really precise, because I remember when I was an undergrad and I had gotten accepted to grad school, one of my professors, his only advice was, everybody there is going to be the best from their place. So don't expect that you'll be the best, because everybody is going to have been the best. And not only don't expect that you're going to be the best, but expect that there are going to be a couple of people who are initially really upset and really nasty because they're not the best anymore. And it was great advice. So, and I think a lot of that, I've never been really interested in the nonfiction novel or the highly autobiographical narrative, and so this was a way to play with that. Because what I usually try to do, the reason that my first two books were historical fiction, was that my interest is really, when I go to a book to read it, and the same when I go to write one, I want to meet somebody I don't know, and I want to go somewhere that I've never been. And in the case of Yellow Jack, 1840s New Orleans, there's no way for me to get there, so I had to kind of write my way there. In my second book, it's 1940s New Orleans, and I had to kind of write myself there. And so when I wanted to write a contemporary book, I decided that I would take on the challenge of writing about a place that I had been, graduate school, but kind of not been. I did not go to school at Cornell, where Hannah goes. I did not go to school at the University of Tennessee, where she's an undergrad. And I'm not a woman.
How about University of Nebraska, Lincoln?
No,
Okay.
The thing about all three of those places is that I know people, and one of the kind of jokes behind it too is everybody I know from Tennessee, Nebraska, and Cornell I like very much. They're not at all like the caricatured professors that appear in the book. But I spent 2 months one summer in Ithaca, just about enough to get the feeling of Ithaca but not be overwhelmed by the specifics and the truth of Ithaca.
Yeah.
I spent 2 months one summer in Lincoln, Nebraska, just enough to kind of get the feeling of Lincoln. And I grew up in the Midwest.
What the streets look like, or I want to count where do people go skinny dipping in Ithaca?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But Josh, I just want to go back, because the audience, I didn't know much about this before I read the novel. These Indian captivity narratives, talk about that for a minute. It's almost a genre that I guess only graduate students read nowadays.
Probably so. At the time...
But what is a typical Indian captivity narrative?
The plot of a typical Indian captivity narrative, the plot of pretty much any Indian captivity narrative, is the same. It's a first-person narrative. Usually, if it's not a first-person narrative, it's being recounted to a third-person narrator who tells the story of a woman who's part of a group of settlers whose village encampment compound is attacked by Native Americans. Usually the same things happen. The Native Americans arrive, they kill all the men, they kill all the children who can't walk.
In New England, too, isn't it?
In New England,
yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
This is usually happening in Massachusetts. That Mary Rowlandson's is in Massachusetts. So the Native Americans come, they capture the women and the children who can walk, they march them into the woods, they hold on to them for a little while, then they sell them to the French, who forcibly convert them to Catholicism, and then the French ransom them back to the English. And so that kind of cycle goes on.
There's an undercurrent of sex, because in those, let's call it Puritan days, that was a word that was not mentioned. But there's this feeling like, what did the Indians do? Right,
and they're in some ways I think that they're clearly the prototype of the Gothic novel, because they're about the darkness and what's in the woods. And for Europeans, they were very. Mary Rowlandson's book supposedly was the if we computed it per capita, like based on the population that was on the planet at that point, and then the sales of that book, it would be the second best-selling book of all time, only behind the Bible. Because everybody read it.
That.
Everybody, it was a huge sensation in England and in Europe. It got translated. Of course, it was a huge sensation in America too. And it had all these elements. It had the salacious nature that you talk about. It was also wildly popular as anti-Native American propaganda.
Right.
It was used as a justification for doing away with the Native Americans. It was also very popular as anti-French and anti-Catholic propaganda. And so it had all of these things going on in it. And it kind of ends up as being one of those things that gets, I think, lost because even though we don't have much history compared to Europeans, there's a lot of good salacious American history.
There's a salacious element that.
Yeah.
Now Josh, you put a smile on my face because I've read the book, and so here's our protagonist, Hannah Guttentag, and she's given this Indian captivity narrative by her favorite professor, a woman named Professor Pat Caldwell, and she's reading the goodness and sovereignty of God, and she reads about this woman whose family is killed by the Indians, except the husband survives because at the last moment when the Indians are attacking, he slips on a dress because the Indians didn't kill the women. Now, why am I laughing about that? But you did a wonderful job just evoking that, because Mary herself, Sarah Ward, is going like, what kind of man am I married to?
Yeah.
Am I reading that right?
Yeah, and the idea there, I think, was that I wanted to make up a captivity narrative.
Okay.
And so I invented that captivity narrative, and the fact that it would be, they're pretty ridiculous, the real ones. So I thought that making up one that would be that ridiculous would also work, and then I could play off of the fact that Hannah starts to have questions about Frank and what she's gotten herself into, and so I can play this kind of mirroring with Sarah Weed and her husband, who cross-dresses to not get initially done in by the Indians.
Having read the novel, A True History of the Captivation, Transport to Strange Lands and Deliverance of Hannah Gutenberg, here's my impression of Hannah Gutenberg. She's really bright. She's got kind of a crazy mother. She's from Nashville, has an inferiority complex, like so many, I dare say, like many Southerners who think that if you're from the North or Cornell or Harvard or Yale, you must be smarter up there, but you ain't. She's accepted to Cornell. She finds that the people there are weirder than she can ever imagine, and they're all smart. She gets married. I can say this without giving away too much. Am I so far so good about this characterization?
Yeah.
And she's a survivor.
Yeah.
And there's this notion at the end of the book, like a good poem, Josh, you put it all together and there's redemption. I'm not going to give the redemption away. I want people to read this book.
I do too.
I want to move on for a minute because you do teach creative writing. I do this for a living sometimes. I interview authors who write novels, and I'm reminded of what Samuel Johnson once said of Milton's Paradise Lost. None wished it longer, even though it was a brilliant work. Do you purposely write short, accessible novels? Because it's so refreshing.
Well, they seem to be getting shorter and shorter. Each one. Yellow Jack, which is a modest book. I think it's 250 pages.
Yeah.
Now when I look at it, it seems like a huge book. My second book was, I think, 150, and this new book comes in at about the same page count. And part of that has to do with the fact that I'm really interested in form. And the Hannah Guttentag book, the new novel, is very much trying to play off of that, the women's Indian captivity narrative form. And those were quite brief, in part because they were intended to be kind of pulp and easily digested. So, my interest now more and more is about kind of distillation and omission. What can I boil down to get the essence that I need, and what can I leave out and still get what I want? And that definitely is going on, I think, in this book. And then, as I said, they get shorter and shorter. The next thing I'm writing will probably be unpublishable because it's going to be like an 80-page novel, which is, that the two things I've been doing recently are like the 2-page short story and the 80-page novel, and those are both not exactly the bestseller.
That just reminds me of a story when I was in graduate school. A colleague of mine passed in a paper, and he said, "Had I more time, I wouldn't have passed in so many pages." And the professor said, "Presumably, if you had enough time, you'd have turned in nothing."
Yeah,
I
get
know.
it down to what counts.
Right. I'm going to be personal right now, if you don't mind. You've got 3 excellent novels under your belt. You're the co-chairman of a distinguished Georgia State University creative writing program. I've seen that develop in the last 30 years. It's one of the best in the country. When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Well,
I'm talking about you could have been a basketball player, rock and roller, come on.
Well, yeah, I guess when you're in grade school, there are all kinds of options. I always liked to write, and it was one of the things that I always have been kind of. It's allowed me to get away with things. If I'm lazy about some things, I can usually write a pretty good or if I were lazy about some things, I could write a good paper and get away with it. But what I really wanted to be was a visual artist. However, I just do not have the manual dexterity for it. I just can't paint and I can't draw. And so this was always kind of the great sadness in my life. And then I decided I wanted to be a journalist because that's what I thought writing meant. That's what you could do for a living. I mean, there were, of course, novelists and poets, but this was the early 80s, and it didn't occur to me that was an actual career option. So I went to the University of Maryland. By then it was the late 80s. And
From Normal, Illinois to College Park,
I
Maryland?
Actually, when I was my
that.
family moved from Normal, there were a couple of stops in between, and we ended up right outside of D.C. in Silver Spring, Maryland.
I know that area real well.
Yeah, right outside of the Beltway. And I went to Maryland.
A lot of well-to-do hippie types when I was there.
Yeah, well,
I got a job in the government. I make $80,000 a year, and my boss says
I went to high school with those folks.
Okay.
But it was an interesting experience to then go to Maryland, where a lot of those folks still were. But at Maryland, to get into the journalism school, you had to type 65 words a minute on an IBM Selectric.
And that was a requirement?
Well, you had to have a certain GPA, and you had to type 65 words a minute on the IBM Selectric. So the first semester of my junior year, which was the first time that you were allowed to announce your major, I went and took the typing test and failed miserably. And they said, well, you have to come back in a week. And so I went back a week later, and there was no way I was going to get 65 words a minute on an IBM Selectric. I didn't really type at all. And I said to the woman who was administering the test, this is the only requirement to get into the journalism school? And she said, yes. And I said, but I've got all, my grades in these writing classes. And she said, that doesn't matter, 65 words a minute on the Selectric. And so I was then enrolled in a creative writing class, the first one I had ever taken, and it seemed great, and nobody was asking me to type 65 words a minute in that class, and so I kind of gravitated that way. So in many ways, it was the path of least resistance, I guess. And then it kind of blossomed. Then I had some really great teachers. A woman named Sibby O'Sullivan was my first, and then I was fortunate to have Howard Norman, whose
name rings the bell.
He's a novelist. He's been a finalist for the National Book Award a couple of times, and all these things I didn't know. He was just the guy teaching the class that I registered for, but he was a great mentor. And then I was with a great cohort of student writers at LSU, people who have gone on to very successful careers.
Wow.
So things worked out well. But now I've become instead of the football dad, I'm the visual arts dad. I'm always trying to get my kid to paint. Don't you want to paint? Wouldn't you like to be a painter?
Yeah, but now you're the coach instructing kids on how to be writers.
Right.
I'm dying to ask you this question. I'm talking about decades ago. I took a creative writing course at a school in Massachusetts, and Andrew Fettler was the professor. And remember there'd be cocktails at night, and there'd be two famous writers, and they'd read, and then so you'd ask questions, and someone asked a famous writer what do you think about literature? And he said, I love words. They come easy to me. Blah, blah. And Fettler gets up there and says, a good writer must be fearful of words. You must choose there's a continuum there. Like, where do you find yourself? I mean, to me, writing is the hardest thing in the world.
Well, teaching creative writing, it's a very odd profession. I'm very happy to have the job. It's something I never expected was going to happen, even when I was going to grad school and I was working for Andre as an editorial assistant on the magazine. My guess was that I was going to end up doing some kind of editorial work, and I, again, kind of fell into teaching. I was teaching composition in a couple of places, and then when Yellow Jack came out, I rolled the dice and applied for some creative writing teaching jobs, and I was very lucky.
And you won
to
some
get
fellowships.
One. I did. I've done. It's been a good run, and now I'm to the point where I can kind of stop and think deeply about teaching creative writing. And one of the things that I say to my students all the time is that almost without exception, all of them would get to the point that they'll get to without me, but I'll get them there faster. And that's what I think is good. I mean, those rules about, loving words or being afraid of words, I think that the problem with those is that while they're good for general advice, they're a little bit dangerous because there are some people who really work well if they're fearful of their words. There are some people who work well if they're in love with language. And as a teacher, what I try to do is recognize what they're up to and help them along in that direction, not try to redirect them in some way that I feel is right.
I'm going to ask you this question too, and it's more for the audience. You teach creative writing at a university, and I'm just wondering how you, as one who has climbed the rungs of academia, very successfully winning fellowships, you're also a popular writer. Teresa Weaver of Atlanta Magazine, former book editor of the AJC, said that your latest novel, A True History, is one of the best books from Georgia in the year 2012. I think it's one of the best books in America in 2012.
Oh, thank you.
But see if we can figure out what I'm asking, because I'm having trouble articulating it. You're in many ways an academic, and you're writing, and you want people to read your books, what is the tension between popular fiction and literary fiction? Because I would think that you're telling the students, like, crap sells, but don't write it? Or
well,
there's a question there somewhere, Josh.
There's always a lot of stress in the workshop about, especially with the undergraduates, about the fact that they want to write something that's commercially successful. And a lot of their experience with writing is with J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter books and those things. So what I try to do is explain to them that no matter what book they want to write, if they want to write Twilight, their version of it, of course, or a science fiction novel, they have to have fundamentals. They have to have the basics. And so when I'm in the classroom, what I'm stressing are those things, kind of these foundations of narrative, and that you can take anywhere. Even if you're writing film, they're good to have. So, it's a...
Okay, now you're up there on the hill, as they say, of literature. Everybody's looking up at you. What's the judging from your students? I'm curious now. What's the state of writing? I mean, we hear about e-books and the erosion of standards. And do you feel comfortable with the future of fiction?
I do, because I think that the stress that we're hearing a lot about is the stress that commercial publishers have. They have done very little to change a business model that is 100 years old, and now they're freaking out. They were very slow to understand what to do about e-books. There's still a lot of publishers who just don't understand e-books, and they're getting left in the dust. And I heard an interesting comment given by Richard Nash, who he publishes something called Red Lemonade. It's a publishing house, and his claim is that there's a continuum of readers, and those readers some of them are willing to pay 99 cents to read something, some of them are willing to pay $999 to read something, and New York Publishing decided that the only part of that continuum they were interested in was $9.99 to $24.99, and everything else was out. And his question was, why don't we do the whole continuum? Because we can now.
It's funny,
with
your publisher, Deliverance, they simultaneously publish the e-book with the hard copy.
Yes, and if you buy directly from them, they're doing this thing where if you buy a book directly from them, they give you the hard copy book and then immediately send you the ebook. So you can read both, or you can give one away, or you can do whatever you want. So there are people who are doing these things, these innovative things.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been talking to one of my favorite novelists. His name is Josh Russell. His first novel was Yellow Jack, about New Orleans daguerreotypes, Claude Marchand, Yellow Fever. My Bright Midnight, set in the late 1940s in America, and his latest novel, A True History of the Captivation, Transport to Strange Lands, and Deliverance of Hannah Guttentag. I love to say that title fast.
It's a good one.
Josh, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And folks, go out and buy these books. Wonderful, great reading. That's it. That was easy, huh?
That was fast.
Comments and opinions expressed on Writers in Focus are those of the individual participants and are presented for the purpose of discussion only. No endorsements by Atlanta Fulton Public Library System or Fulton County government are intended, and none should be presumed.